So I was just reading about Otto Ege, who was a teacher and a book dealer, collector in Cleveland in the first half of the 20th century. And what he's most famous for in the circles of people who care about this kind of thing is that he was a sort of self-proclaimed biblioclast. So he had this rather large collection of medieval manuscripts, um, which I will point out, unlike printed books, are one-of-a-kind objects, right? Um, really works of art in a way that not that like a book is not a work of art, but a work of art in a way that a book that even one that was printed in the 1600s is not really. Um, and he sort of tore them up and sold them to people and institutions who would not otherwise be able to afford like a full manuscript, say. So if a manuscript had, I don't know, 100 leaves, he would sell 100. He would tear them up and sell each leaf at considerable profit to him, but in an affordable way to some sort of like small university library collection that would not be able to buy the entire thing. And he caged this in terms of this is not a unique act in history. There have always been sort of book terrors, and then he says basically that he's not as bad as the sort of great vandals in book history, like the man who burned down the Library of Alexandria, or Henry VIII, who dissolved the monasteries and sort of divested them of their libraries. But anyway, yeah. So in his defense, he would say, is it not better for 1,000 people who would not otherwise be able to handle, these rare objects, have them, rather than one person, one extraordinarily wealthy person, having them in his own private library. And I think on the whole, he's seen as a bad, sort of a disreputable capitalist, is the sense that I have of what academics think of him today. And that's fair enough. But in the age of before the age of digital distribution and digital sort of archival collections, it is kind of cool that now, and I think he sold a lot of them to Midwestern universities. So there's a lot of like single leaves of medieval manuscripts in tiny Midwestern universities, and now there's a whole project going on to sort of like trace them and sort of find out their provenance and sort of catalog where each of them came from, which is pretty cool. And so I understand the plight of the people who have to work with this material, but I think that is a sort of interesting, that he's an interesting guy in book history, right? And it kind of reminded me of this other guy, Sir Arthur Evans, who he led the excavation of Knossos on the island of Crete, where he found this thing that he dubbed the Palace of Minos, which is sort of a misnomer because it's not really a royal residence as much as it is, as is often the case with these ancient buildings, a sort of community center where there were sort of some bureaucratic things, some religious sort of holdings, as well as some agricultural things, like we see like wine presses and stuff like that. So it was kind of like a a bureaucratic cultural center, but he I think the reason he called it the Palace of Minos is because the labyrinthine structure of it reminded him of the myth of the Minotaur, and there were he also found some sort of frescoes with like the famous like bull leaping fresco, I think maybe is from there. If in any case there were frescoes with bulls, and that also reminded him of the Minotaur, and so he kind of constructed this sort of vision of the palace, and in the excavation of it, he sort of started to reconstruct it right away. And he used sort of modern materials, and he built up these sort of rooms and pillars, and I think he even redid entire frescoes, and some of the he hired like a couple of Swiss painters or something like that to repaint some of the walls and the frescoes, and I think some of the frescoes that we have from there that we think of as authentic are almost entirely creations of these Swiss guys at the turn of the century. And I think there too, art historians sort of balk at that now, and it sort of runs against the modern sort of conservation ethics, right? Where the sort of main point of our engagement with art and art history seems to be from the perspective of almost like a museum, where the idea is to conserve as much as possible the original, and when changes have to be made, it is for really drastic reasons, like this whole thing is going to crumble, or this book is going to disintegrate if we don't rebind it or something like that, and then when the change is made, when the reconstruction is done, it has to be sort of clear what is the original and what is the reconstruction. And so there's an image of like how this fresco could have been redone, and it makes it clear what is the original and what is not, and it's interesting, but quite frankly it just doesn't look that good, because it's not really part of the artistic language. And I know like fragmentation can be interesting, like with Picasso, etc., but it's not part of the language of this particular piece, and so it doesn't really make coherent sense in the same way. But yeah, I was just thinking, with Ege and Evans, I was just thinking about the conservation ethics with regards to music, and how we seem to sort of have some of that, even in music, which is not like a temple, or an architectural site, or a medieval manuscript, or a painting, in that it doesn't really live anywhere. It doesn't live on the sheet. It doesn't live in a file. It sort of lives in memory. The recording, even, well, let's take like a manuscript or like a sheet of music. That's really just a tool to convey how to play this thing, or some of how to play this thing. And the music lives in the moment that it is being played, right? And even when it is being recorded and then you listen back to the recording, there's this peculiar thing where you sort of experience music mostly as a memory, because the moment that you hear it, it's already gone, right? So even recordings are not really where the music lies. I really think that the music lies in the souls of the performers and the listeners, right? My point is that I think in classical music especially, and even in early music, where there's a lot of lip service paid to the idea that the notation is not the music. I think there's a lot of how would this have gone, and how would this be played, and looking at ornament tables and treatises, and all that stuff is interesting, but I think it's interesting only insofar as it takes you out of the modern cliches, right? For example, there's a moment in the Quantz treatise where he says that the termination of the trill must be played at the same tempo as the trill itself, and in time with the rest of the phrase, which is quite different than how a lot of people play terminations now, which is quite a bit slower. that's interesting. You know, it sounds odd when you play it that way, and you know, it doesn't mean that it was always played that way or that you always have to play it that way, but it was done enough that one guy at least wrote about it. And so that's an interesting consideration, and it gets you out of the modern cliche of the termination of a trill. Um, you know, it's stuff like that that I think is really interesting in treatises, and for sure studying the and you know, I wrote about this also kind of in the liner notes to the album that we released last year, Through a Glass Darkly, and the liner notes were called on authenticity, and I'll link to that in the description maybe. But I really think that, you know, the study of ancient sources and instruments and all that stuff is valuable, but it is the soil out of which the performance can grow, but it is not the performance itself. You know, we really ought not to be sort of entrenched in these sort of conservation ethics, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, I was just, as I was saying, I was reading about Ege and thinking about Evans, and just not that I would necessarily defend them, because, you know, I don't know enough about the matter. I'm not an art historian or a book historian, and I'm not, you know, closely working with the materials that they worked with. So it's not really, I don't really have skin in this game, you know. But I was kind of just marveling at the energy that they seem to have, you know, back in the day, where it was, you know, it seems like they really felt that they were part of art history, that they were part of the culture, and that you know, your job is not to preserve it, but to sort of move it in some way. You know, like the whole reason I think that Sir Arthur Evans wanted to reconstruct the palace in this way, in this sort of bold way, was to sort of recreate the grandeur of it, right? And with Otto Ege too, where, you know, he sort of seemed to feel this, you know, ideological drive to get these manuscripts in the hands of as many people as possible, while, you know, obviously making a profit for himself as well. You know, we shouldn't discount that. But yeah, it was this sort of like, you know, get your hands dirty element to art and even conservation, you know, and that is quite appealing to me, you know. And as a musician, I think it's kind of cool that we can sort of be a little bit more reckless with that attitude. You know, we are not really working with unique materials, right? So to go out, you know, especially to go out in a performance and really sort of handle with care, you know, the pieces that you're playing, I think is against the spirit of it, right? So, you know, what I would say is, you know, look to the sort of the biblioclasts like Otto Ege, to sort of have the kind of energy, you know, that is quite fun and playful and sort of, you know, hands-on, interactive with the music, because that's what it deserves, and you know, and you can do that without harming the music at all, because it doesn't live in your performance and it doesn't live in the manuscript. So yeah, I don't know. Have fun.